And we found that that additional cost of infrastructure to get you from that 5 kilometres down the road for power, water, rail and so on was costing roughly an extra €100,000 per head.
There's a perception amongst the Irish public that we're not great at delivering infrastructure.
So what we actually need is a housing typology to get us from cradle to grave, quite literally.
We need to depoliticise housing.
And that's the other key piece that we're missing in Ireland. We're not making data-led decisions.
They have no expertise or knowledge of construction or engineering driving a project and getting a project over the line. You know, the burning question that was on everybody's lips there a week or two ago when we found out about the Apple windfall, what would we do with this money? So, assuming Simon gets to be the Taoiseach again after Friday, and you were Simon, what would you do with it?
Has to be infrastructure. It has to be services infrastructure. We have so many schemes that are stalled because ESB or Irish Water or TII don't have the necessary infrastructure in place, and it's stopping housing units being completed. So, you know, there's lots of talk about where they're putting this money, and they might invest this money or put it into different things. But a lot of people are saying it must be infrastructure. And, you know, it's a lump sum of money. Infrastructure projects are, you know, real cash guzzlers, and therefore put it in to unlock areas. And the key piece is, where do we put it to get the best bang for our buck? That's the major question. And I don't know if anybody has the answer to that as we sit here now. But that's why, you know, in the Housing Commission report, there was a recommendation there, you know, to have this central infrastructure body or housing group, whatever you want to call it. Someone that has the power and the knowledge to say, okay, instead of everyone running off in different directions, spending your money in different places and it not being joined up, say, okay, you know, is it Clonbarris? Are we going to put it there? Is it Cherrywood? Is it spread in a number of different areas? But wherever we get the biggest bang for our buck from a housing point of view is where we should spend the Apple money.
You're saying it's water, it's gas, it's power.
CII, like if you think about it, you know, we've had Lewis schemes, we've had train upgrades, DART upgrades that are all, you know, coming down the track, pardon the awful pun, but they're not there yet. And I think it was someone in TII was saying to me recently, the Lewis lines this year are going to carry just around the same amount as the entire Irish rail network, right? And as we know, they're jam-packed. And if we produce infrastructure that can carry people like the very successful Lewis, that were delivered very successfully. You know, we're always very critical of infrastructure projects. Those were a success. And so the route out to Lucan, or, you know, the potential route to the airport, albeit that the metro is obviously a better spend in that regard, is really going to help, you know, to transport people, cut down on emissions, help the environment, and then we get denser housing built along those lines, which obviously is a much more sustainable spend also than urban sprawl, suburban housing, you know. So, and it feeds into what the National Planning Framework is trying to do with compact growth.
And you're plugging into existing infrastructure by like the water and the gas networks, that you're not developing brand new greenfield areas sprawling outside the cities.
Yeah, and there's been a couple of reports. We did a report actually for the Housing Commission, which looked at, it was a hypothetical situation, but it looked at the area of Lucan. And Lucan roughly has about 50,000 people. And then we have Leixlip, about 5 kilometres down the road, that has 15,000 people. And we did this exercise to say, what if when Lucan was expanding, you designed Lucan to take 65,000 people, not 50. And we found that additional cost of infrastructure to get you from that 5 kilometres down the road for power, water, rail and so on was costing roughly an extra €100,000 per head, right? So think about what you can do with that money, right? Now, that is happening, and it's another big, it will be a game changer in housing to move away from, so we had housing, we had our 3-bed semi-Ds, and then we had apartments. And we know that there are difficulties with apartments, getting them to work from a viability point of view. So, but we had to get the density up, because otherwise we just sprawl. We've got urban sprawl. So we need to deliver and to build in a more compact setting. So now you're getting things like duplexes, triplexes, this type of still kind of own door, but not apartment block. So people prefer that. It's denser, and therefore more sustainable. And we know the difficulties with apartments. We leave apartments for the more real urban centres, right, that are fed by darts or train lines or metros. And then for suburbia, should move into more compact growth.
We're talking about building infrastructure to enable or to facilitate the improvement in the delivery of housing. But there's a perception amongst the Irish public that we're not great at delivering infrastructure. Tell me, first of all, how do you respond to that? But also, what are the things we're doing well, and what are the solutions to the things that we're not doing as well?
Well, I think people. Let's look at infrastructure. I think that our roads projects, if you go back in time, and I mean go back 25, 30 years, there was an issue with overruns on roads projects. They changed the procurement on roads projects, and then they put in place design and build and competitions, and then they were doing roads very well. They shifted the risk onto the party that could take it in a measured way, and then the roads were being delivered by private companies or JVs in a good way. So I think that's positive. So it was shaky at the beginning. They sorted it. It works really well. I think ESB deliver infrastructure very well. They're seen as world class. We know we've got an infrastructure deficit, but that's a separate thing from being able to successfully deliver projects. So they successfully deliver projects. Then I think the tunnel at the time, the port tunnel, a lot of debate over that and cost overruns. But we don't do these projects often. That's the problem. We don't have that knowledge. I think the Lewis projects were seen as a success from a budget point of view.
So it's because we're a small country. So we're not like a big Spain or, an Italy or one of these large countries who's constantly delivering, or even Britain, who's constantly delivering infrastructure trains. And we've never done it before. We don't have an underground like London does.
Correct.
So we've never done it before. So we don't have that know-how and expertise in-house in our government departments.
Definitely not in the government departments. But I think if you look at TII, they have a lot of expertise in-house. If you look at the NDFA, National Development Finance Agency, they have a lot of expertise in-house. So, for example, other infrastructure like third-level schools, secondary level schools that are now really big projects like 1,100 pupil schools, primary care centres. Again, the government set up an expert group internally that got that expertise, hired in the expertise, and then started delivering projects, and then set up this, a bit like what the LDA are doing now. So we have done it. Obviously, we've got a children's hospital as a one-off, which is not a good example. But we have all of those other infrastructure projects, and that's the type of infrastructure that we're talking about. So that's what we need to, and we know if you went to ESB or Ishka Éireann or TI in the morning and said, here is 3 billion, here's 5 billion, here's 8 billion, whatever the figures are, they would have their priority projects for that.
Yeah.
And then I think as long as those priority projects are connected to each other and enable housing, then that's the right mix. So who is it that makes the decision to say that's where that money has been spent? That's the key piece.
That comes back to what you were saying about having joined up thinking. You had mentioned a couple of different agencies that have been set up to kind of give oversight and advice on the delivery of infrastructure. The Future Ireland Fund, Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund, and there was another one you mentioned yesterday. Was it ISDF?
Oh, ISIF, yeah.
ISIF,
Yeah.
yes.
So that's more funding, I suppose.
That's more funding.
Yeah.
Rather than oversight and guidance.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
so they don't really dictate where the funds should be channeled to?
They will choose where to invest.
Okay.
You know, so strategic infrastructure funds, they will decide where to put the money and then how the money, and they typically go in as a joint venture with a private sector lead, and they're providing equity if you want.
Okay.
Another good idea.
A good way to deliver it. A good way to deliver it.
Because we don't, as we sit today, we don't have the funds. There is a funding gap. So if you look at housing, if you look at infrastructure, there is a finance gap, and the government produced 2 reports over the last 12 months, both of which were very illuminating. Here is our 14 billion gap in housing to get to the numbers, the kind of numbers we need to get to annually. So then when you look at that in the light of the Apple windfall, tax windfall, you kind of go, oh, it's not that much, is it? Right? So we definitely need private money coming into the country, but we haven't been welcoming of private money when it came. Mm-hmm. We came up with all kinds of bird names for them when they decided to land on our
Carrion
shores.
eating birds.
Yes, but we do need them.
We do.
And they've been kind of categorized in this way. But when you meet these funds, they are teacher funds from America. They are people trying to put their money into long-term products, right? And that's what's behind, when apartments, for example, post-crash, we were trying to get apartment schemes off the ground again. And we were advising a lot of clients on apartment schemes. We had one big client. Are apartment schemes ever going to be viable? Right? And all we had at that time was the single model, which was build to sell. Right? And then following that, we had the build to rent model. And then with the build to rent model, funds came. Okay, so we're in a period of low interest rates. The funds needed to find places to put their money to get a return for their individual investors. And next thing, apartments took off.
What was the regulatory? You've said that the financial environment here was conducive to them investing, but why did they opt for build to rent apartment schemes as opposed to build to sell houses or apartment schemes?
So I suppose because what they want is long-term investment. So they want to invest in a product for 15, 20, 25 years. Okay, so if I'm built to sell, the only period that I can fund is that really risky period of the development finance. And that's only kind of 2 to 3 years. And I fund that, and I'm going back to my very conservative teacher funds with their hard-earned cash, and I'm saying to them, I'm putting your money into this thing. It's only 2 or 3 years, and you might get your money back, you may not, because these things are risky. So they're not going to invest in that. I'm putting into something which is locked and loaded. There's a big demand in Ireland, and that's the key. There's a demand. We've got a stable political environment. Our jobs, our economy is in great shape. We were ticking boxes, And so next thing, something was working. And this is my big thing. This is the kind of closing doors strategy that we have in Ireland. When something looks like it's working, we decide to stop it. And usually because of
Public outcry
or the politics on the other side. And that's why we need housing is too important to be politicised.
Yes.
It has to be a thing that is there, and like the Housing Commission report talks about, looking out over 20 or 30 years, saying, this is the plan, this is what we need to do, and leave the kind of political emotion out of it.
The 4-year vote catching strategies.
Everyone's saying they're going to do X, Y, and Z, but let's look at it in reality. It is a practical thing. It's complex because it's got lots of moving parts and lots of different masters. Okay, and that's the main issue.
I could be wrong, but I think I read something once that you needed fewer windows and you could have fewer types. You could offer fewer templates.
Build to rent had a couple of differences. One, you didn't need to have balconies on all units. The other one was you could have more apartments off one core. And then in build to sell apartments, overall they're 5% larger. 50% of them have to be 10% bigger, so 5% overall. So you didn't need that. But you did need amenity space, 2 to 4% amenity space. When you actually look at the schemes, because this is all we do, right? When you look at the schemes, they are not that different.
No.
Now, people will argue with you that black is white on that point.
Yeah.
Right? And when you look at the schemes today that are being taken by approved housing bodies, by councils, or as built to sell, right? So a lot of people are just, going for build to sell planning applications and renting them. And that's what they did before, because with the build to rent, you had to keep it for 15 years as a rental product. So the products aren't that different. But I said that at a conference last year, and someone stood up after me from Dublin City Council and said that they hadn't planned to say anything, but when they heard what they said, they had to completely and utterly disagree with me. It is a completely lesser product.
And I would have thought logically, if I'm a fund and I'm planning to hang on to this asset for 15, 20, whatever years, I'm probably going to put materials that are going to have greater longevity in it and that are going to endure, the quality will endure over this period of time to save myself swapping it out and constantly maintaining and upgrading.
Yep.
I would have thought that the quality of delivery could possibly be even higher because they're planning to hang on to it. Because if you're building them to sell them, you just want them to look good for the show apartment.
And in a lot of cases, if you build to sell, you're not fitting out the apartment. If you build to rent, you are fitting them out.
Yeah.
But the public areas will always be like that. And the other thing is that they're more interested in sustainability, and they do want their product to last. So they are looking at the life cycle cost as opposed to just the capital cost, which again is a positive thing. But going back to that, at the same time that the funds come into Ireland and build to rent became a thing, we also had SHD, the fast track planning, come in, and we had the reduction on height caps, right? The abolition of height caps, which meant that we had a lot of bigger apartment schemes. So where they were meant to be kind of 6 or 8 stories, we're now going to 10 to 12. And that all happened at the same time. And I think the public kind of uprising at that point was the SHD planning, this fast track planning route. I didn't get a chance to properly object to that planning, right? So that became the big thing, and judicial reviews really rose in 2018, 2019, up to something like 48% of planning permissions, which was chronic, right?
And that's tying up planners.
Yeah, it's tying up everybody.
Yeah,
and
bureaucracy when they should be planning.
Yeah, and the only people that pay for that are the ultimate renters and purchasers.
It just gets added onto the price tag.
Just gets rolled up. So you hold back an apartment for a year, that 4 or 5 grand in interest, it's just added on, right? So that was really unfortunate. That was closed down. At the same time, we had co-living that came out, which was like student accommodation type living for key workers. Yeah. Right. A few got built. There's a few currently being built, but they're not allowed to go for planning anymore. But again, when we've got such a deficit, we can't be choosy, because we basically said to everyone, okay, we know that you can afford a Fiesta, but we're only going to sell you Mercedes C-Class, right? Give them in different colours, whatever, and then you can all bemoan the fact then you can't afford a Mercedes C-Class.
Even though you're a single person with no children, we're going to give you a Nissan Qashqai.
Yep.
With baby seats in the back.
And a 3-bed semi-D, and you'll wait for them to come.
Yeah.
So what we actually need is a housing typology to get us from cradle to grave, quite literally. So, we need those starter homes. We need the affordable starter homes. We need the kind of, if you look at Europe, and they've got a thing called grey box living that we've talked about before, where you go into your apartment, there's nothing in it. Yeah. In some cases, it's not even a kitchen. You go down to IKEA and you put in your one unit and you move on from there. But we need...
And you leave it as you found it.
Yeah, or you build it up and you live there with your family and then you move on.
Okay.
Right? So with that, we need kind of affordable housing because we've only kind of got a couple of products. Yes, we're not a Swiss Army knife. We're a penknife. We've got an apartment and we've got a 3-bed semi. Now we're seeing a lot more, right? But we need senior living, right? There's been a kind of pushback on senior living. Co-living definitely has a place, but everyone, there's this outcry, and then the politicians that have put it forward kind of go, "Oh, need to pull back from that," right? Because that's not popular, right? And that's not the right way to do it. We need a technical solution from technical team to say, this is how we get to 50,000 units a year.
So do we need to, you said it should be a political issue, we need to depoliticize housing and set up a public body that doesn't answer to a politician, doesn't answer to a political party. Is that what you'd be suggesting?
Yes.
And they're senior civil servants and they're engineers and they're construction people.
Yeah, and I think the makeup is really important.
Yes.
The makeup of that body is really important. And recently I had the same suggestion on a conference really, and I had a prep call beforehand with Ivan Yates, who was the MC. And I put forward the same thing. And he said, my goodness, he says, I let out the longest, loudest groan, he said, when I heard your suggestion. He said, not another quango that takes up 3 years to set up and another 3 years to put into legislation and then fill it, and it doesn't do anything. And I said, well, we already have it to a large part with the LDA, right? We have an agency that's taken a while to get into place and get funded and put into a law, etc. And now it's been filled with a mix of public and private sector people, but with more of a private sector approach that is in a constant feedback loop saying what's working. Okay, so I'm going to do some direct construction, I'm going to do some joint venture, I'm going to do some forward funding over here, right? Now, nothing that anyone ever does is going to be 100% popular. But if it's getting units, producing units, then that's what we want to do. So, and I think we can build on that, and then we can also take that fire that's been lit and take that torch out to local authorities in other areas, right? So,
that'd be like a pilot.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like a chief advisor.
Yes.
And we've had that in the past.
Take the expertise and roll it out across the country.
Yeah, because we are dealing all the time that we're dealing with housing and planning and infrastructure and construction, we're dealing with real technical stuff.
It's funny, like I was only saying this earlier, you come a lot, like sustainability has obviously just jumped into our collective consciousness in the last few years because it's being mandated. But I know there's a lot of people who have got a sustainability qualification, so they know how to collect data and they know how to read data and create a narrative from data and then create a journey, with milestones on it, a sustainability journey. But I've noticed a lot of these people are not, they have no expertise or knowledge of construction or engineering. They have no experience of actually driving a project and getting a project over the line. So I think one of the things, where my question is, where does this leave us as an industry, the construction industry, architecture, engineering, construction, consultant PMs, consultant QSs? Where does that leave us? If we managed to get our shit together and start building, how would we do it? Would we have to hire in lots of people into Ireland to deliver?
From a sustainability point of view, or just to try and get the numbers?
Just to deliver. Yeah. Just to deliver. Not even the sustainability piece.
I think if you look at Ireland over the last few years since COVID, right, where we've had the kind of pretty much collapse of the commercial sector, right, for offices because of all the things that we know about. We've had data centres shut down, we've had retail not really been a live sector, and we've had private resis we were just talking about. So there's lots of expertise out there, and that expertise has now been exporting outside Ireland, right, to mainland Europe and other parts, and bringing its expertise into Europe. You know, if there's a demand in Ireland, right, the construction industry has always been extremely resourceful, right, and if the demand is here, and the need has always been here, but if the demand is here, we'll find a way to get those people back, right, or shift the focus to say, no, you don't have to go 3 days a week to Frankfurt, you can stay in Dublin and build things here.
Yeah.
So, and I don't think the switch is going to flip overnight either.
Yeah.
You know, it's been hit by a number of waves, and it's going to only gradually creep back up again, right? Because this year, contrary to what you've been hearing, you know, are we going to actually even hit last year's numbers, right? So some of the government representatives are talking about high 30s or maybe even 40. I think we'll be struggling to hit 30. We had 32 last year. So, you know, and that largely will be because of apartments, right? And then thankfully this time around, compared back to the crash, which wasn't the same, but when the crash came, we had no public money. This time we had, right? So the government are able to step in, and through the Land Development Agency or the AHBs or the local authorities, were able to fund, to purchase, to directly develop units, but they can only go so far. So if we don't get the private funds coming back in again, we won't be able to ramp up.
Well, let's hope the fallout from Trump won't result in the foreign funds leaving us.
Yeah.
The thing that struck me when you were saying there, data centers. So something like over 20% of our power that we're producing in our grid is going towards data centers. Is that the reason why they were shut down?
If you look at everything, as we said, we have an infrastructure deficit on everything, including power. And now, as someone in the ESB explained to me last year, everything has now got an E in front of it, right? We've got electric cars, we've got e-bikes, our home heating, right, which used to be solid fuel, gas boilers, with the shift away from fossil fuels. Interestingly, we're going back to electricity
and heat pumps.
And heat pumps.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a huge demand coming onto the grid. Okay. And therefore they're looking at all of these power requirement coming from everywhere, and they then have to reinforce the entire grid nationally. So then data centers, which, you know, we're losing and have lost out on a lot of investment in Ireland. And we were seen as, you know, a country that had the knowledge and the expertise to deliver these, because they are large projects, they're technical projects, and now those contractors and consultants like ourselves are now delivering those projects in mainland Europe. Mega projects, you know. The same thing has happened though in other cities in mainland Europe. You know, the power requirement became so high that they had to limit how much was being given to data centers, and then it shifts to other countries or other parts of countries.
Yeah, and I was reading that the big ones, you know, the AWSs and the Googles are talking. I don't think any of them have actually brought a small nuclear, small modular reactor onto site. I don't think any of them have actually done it yet, but what's your view on that?
Like, I suppose if you look at France, like a lot of, you know, France gets a lot of its power from nuclear, the UK somewhat, and like we're all connected by interconnectors as well, and we import, like that's how we have so much renewable power in Ireland. And it's interestingly, when you look at some of the stats that come through, and you see them online every now and again, the actual, you know, high 60s and 70% of renewable power being used by our data centers in Ireland. And then you kind of go, okay, why don't we actually focus on more renewables? Like, what about our offshore, which we've, you know, have not been able to deliver?
Do we have one offshore wind farm?
Yeah, but the rest of the Arklow Bank, you know.
And what's holding us back on the offshore wind piece?
I think it's planning and environmental.
Okay.
Yeah. They're also difficult projects, I think, to get to work.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, back to the old, don't want to get talking about planning too much today.
Yeah. But obviously environmental, be the whole marine, protecting the marine mammals and all that, their habitats and all that type of stuff, Yeah.
And so I think that's pretty complex.
Yeah.
But again, we're able to do it in other countries. And I think we're so, in Ireland to an extent here, maybe go back 30, 40, 50 years, we've had some bad examples of planning or bad examples of public expenditure or even public building. And now we're kind of trying to be perfectionists, right? And perfection being the enemy of good.
Oh yeah, a sort of a knee-jerk reaction, making everything so onerous.
Yeah. And
that there has to be a balance.
Yeah. And we did a report for the government last year on comparing apartments, student and housing across 5 cities, Dublin being one of them, and then across, we did Birmingham, Berlin, Stockholm, and to actually compare why. So there's this constant thing that Ireland is a really expensive place to build. And what we did was we said, okay, there's lots of kind of reports that have been done in the past, but all kind of high level or generic. So we build between X and Y and they build between Y and Z and it's so much cheaper. But we did a really detailed study, right? So we took an actual building here that was built or tendered, thousands of lines of pricing, and then we employed quantity surveying firms in each of the other cities to actually fill out that exact document. We called it the travelling box.
Love it.
So we took our box and we travelled around to the other cities. We said, you price our box. And in a lot of cases, they're looking at this kind of going, I've never priced this type of stuff before, or what's happening. And when the results came back, I was really surprised. So what we were hoping for was to see the big reduction. And then we could really nail why there was a reduction, right? But when it came back, it was like 5% up or down, which you'd get on any tender return in Ireland.
Okay.
And we're kind of going, how's that?
Yeah.
Right? So the second strand of that report was to take the same locations with the same people and then say to them, okay, this was our travelling box, but when you have to deliver suburban or urban apartments, housing or student, what is your cost?
Yeah.
And in that case, it was coming out 17% to 34% cheaper.
Yeah.
Okay, more confusion. Okay, so why? So when we got down to it, what we found was that standardization was a big thing in other places. So size was a thing. We were building slightly bigger units here. But the other thing was our specification, our health and safety, our environmental, our architectural requirements, our planning requirements were all significantly higher.
More onerous.
More onerous.
Yeah.
Right? And there was an example in there with these guys that were pricing our stuff, and I think it was in Berlin. And they said, why do you have 16 different window types?
Yeah.
And we said, well, because we've got 16 different window types. And they said, well, our factory produces 4, and you can turn them this way, that way, or the other way, but you've got 4 to deal with. And it's the big thing that came through, which is really hard to get your hands on, is standardization.
Yeah.
Right? So we're not standardized. We're trying, one developer is trying to outdo the other developer. The planners are saying, well, that one was like that before, but we need more brick and we need more metal and we need more stone on this one to make it nicer again. And we're in this constant game of one-upmanship. Meanwhile, our building regulations are constantly increasing, right? And our cost, our input cost is always increasing. And then you'll get commentary like, when we produced the report and we said an apartment, 2-bed apartment costs 596,000 to build, and everyone kind of goes, that's the developers with their profit. That's the contractors, really just creaming it.
Yeah.
And all these people making all this money, and it's the consultants, of course, and they're taking it, and then it's the robbing banks, and it's this, that, and the other. And over the last few years, and back in 2017, we did a report with the Society of Chartered Surveyors, and it put information out there for the first time for apartments.
Yeah.
And it showed the full cost, the viability, the affordability, and people in the know didn't disagree with it, but it helped to inform the situation. And the Society has done a lot of this series of the real costs of, whether it be housing, apartments, refurbishment, but putting out independent, unbiased information. And that's the other key piece that we're missing in Ireland. We're not making data-led decisions. As you said, it's either knee-jerk, it's politicised, it's reactionary, but it's not data-led.
You carried out the comparison between construction costs, delivering like for like, apples with apples, the same building in all these different cities, and we were more expensive. But it wasn't down to the things that we thought it would be, which was the developers gouging or the contractors gouging. What was it down to then in the end?
The European piece looked at just hard costs, just construction costs.
Yes.
So what it came down to was specification.
Right, okay. So it was at the design stage that the
Yes.
money was being factored in.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and then the other thing was scope. So in some cases here where we fit out the entire place, they don't do that.
Okay,
In
the
some
grey
cases
box.
they may not have ceilings, they may not have flooring, so the kitchens, services, so it would be scant.
And that makes sense because people like to go in and do it the way they want to do it.
Yeah, some people like to walk in to it fully finished, but if you go back to Ireland in the 70s when you built your one-off bungalow, and as Dave McWilliams might have said, you might have the good room.
The good room.
Good
yeah.
room might not have been done for about 5 or 10 years till
Yeah.
you had the money.
Yeah.
And that is the concept of grey box living. We've had
Yeah.
it here for a long time. But we're afraid to do anything here that kind of, because in our heads there's shoebox apartments.
Yes.
Goes back to bachelor's walk.
Agrarian mindset. We need our patch of land.
Yeah, and we need everything perfect.
We can't conceive of the idea of living in an apartment and not having our bit of grass, our bit of land.
So we had the specification, we had the scope,
Yeah.
and then the other thing was just regulations.
Okay.
Right, which is hard to kind of pin down exactly what piece of regulation, what U value drives what cost within a building. But there are a number of those things, and health and safety, and also our oversight.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing was in other cities, they were aspiring to be Ireland. They said, we really would like to get to a point where we've got your building control system in place. We need to get to a place where we're matching your health and safety output. So we think we're sitting here and we're looking inward and we kind of go, oh, we're no good and we don't get this and we don't get that and we're not good enough. In actual fact, in some cases, we've gone overboard.
People are aspiring to be
Irish.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
But that all costs money.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that we need this body. It's non-political. It is not affiliated to any political party or to vote catching policies every 4 years. It is populated with people who are knowledgeable about design, so who can address the design at the start to embrace templates, modularity,
Exactly.
rolling out, repeats, to make things cheaper that way, and also to have a more cohesive integration with all of the other things, the infrastructure pieces, the water, the power, the gas, the roads, the public transport. This is the utopian society.
Yeah, and it's not even like...
It's possible, like it's not a utopian
yeah,
society.
It's not.
It is possible.
It's what we should be doing.
Yeah, it's like how you approach a construction project.
Yeah. You have to have your pieces. You don't start your cake unless you've all your ingredients.
Tell me about the Vienna model. You were telling me about this the other day. What's that?
So the Vienna model is something that Dublin has looked at, but it's where the state plays an active role in housing development, either the provision of housing or the funding of housing, and the provision of multi-tenure within the same development. Okay, so you've got a full mix, and Ireland has done this in different places. So where a local authority has land, and they go to that land and they say, okay, and they might get planning for what they want on that land, or they might say, private sector, you go and get me planning, but this is what I want. And so take O'Devney Gardens or Oscar Traynor Road or Fingal Scheme, Churchfields, and there's a number of them. And they did the same in the South Docks, very successful. So the public sector, I have the land. This is what I want, right? I want a third of these apartments or houses to be cost rental, and I want a third of them to be affordable purchase, and a third of them, or another 10%, can be social, and the remainder is going to be for private for sale. and you go and develop those, and that's done under competition. So you're getting the best value for money, and the developer delivers a turnkey product. And then the state comes along and says, okay, I'm buying that third off you here, and you're taking this third, or you're selling this for affordable purchase, I'm buying that social off you, and then you're taking care of the rest. So what you get there is certainty, right? And certainty of outcome. It's still, these projects are big projects, they're complicated and all the rest. But in a recent report we did with Enterprise Ireland and EY, they asked us, how do you get the SME market to grow? So we met with the SME market, we held workshops, and we got their feedback.
In the construction industry.
Yeah, developers, builders that are in the construction industry.
Yeah, to bring up the next Glen Vase or whatever it is.
Exactly, yeah. And if we've got all these other players, so we've got a few big names, and then we've got lots of little names. Mm-hmm. And what about if we can dial them up 20 or 40 or 50%? How do we do that, right? And so we wanted to hear how those companies would grow. And when they would come to the workshop, we said, we don't want to talk about planning or funding. And they said, well, we're not going to come, right? Because they are the blockages. And that right up here in this pipeline, these are the blockages. So we can take care of our business and we can scale our own businesses. We need certainty, right? And so give us certainty. So take control of some of the things that are not in our control. Zoning, planning, infrastructure, etc. Right? And then we move on. So in the kind of so-called Vienna model, some of those things are taken care of by the state. Right? So they take out those blockages, there's the way, and they clear the place for the developer to do what they are good at.
Yeah, and that again is a non-political.
Yeah. And it's happening.
Yes.
It's happening already.
Because it takes time to deliver these things.
It takes a lot of
time. And you can't be changing with the political environment.
Yeah. I've often used the kind of analogy of the oil tanker, right?
Yes.
And the oil tanker goes from A to B, and then midway across the Irish Sea, the captain gets a message to, stern or whatever, or starboard, and the next thing it's out there in the middle of the sea just doing nothing.
Yeah, because it takes 20 miles to stop.
Yeah, and then it needs to turn.
Yeah.
And then it needs to turn back again.
Yeah.
But I think that if we look at the things that are working, right, and then we just amplify those and we multiply those.
Yes.
As opposed to focusing on closing doors.
Yes.
We're opening doors. And I think that's what the Land Development Agency is doing. And there's expertise in there, and it just needs to be funded more. And that's the type of body that you want. And if that body then has control or has connections into all of the other parts that it needs in terms of the infrastructure, then I think that would be a very positive result.
As a marketer and as a communicator, today we spent half an hour talking about all the positive things that have been put in place and all the things that are working and all of the changes that have been put in place to address some of the challenges around delivery. But the general public, as a rule, is only hearing, if it bleeds, it leads about bike sheds and security huts and the new children's hospital. We're not hearing about the positive stories. So it's been great to hear, good news. And also we have to have a bit of patience. I mean, every country in the world is struggling with housing.
Yeah.
Name one that isn't. Mm-hmm. I mean, Canada are probably doing well because they're just amazing at everything.
Singapore
are doing well.
Singapore had a housing problem and they set up a national housing body and developed their own. Now, Singapore is unique, but they are focused on home ownership and delivering affordable homes to their people.
Tiny, very, very dense.
Very dense.
Not a lot of land to spare. No. I mean, we've loads of land.
So lots of high rise. But the thing is, we talk about high rise here. It's a bit of a laugh when we talk about 8 or 10 or 12 stories, and they've got proper high rise buildings, but with multi-generational living. So they may have 3 generations, right, living in the one, and they may have units on top or beside each other, right. So where the grandparents might be there to look after the children, the parents are working, and so on. Right? So they've adapted it really well. So
they've designed for the society in which they live.
So, if we go over 2 stories, we think we can't breathe or live or whatever else. And sometimes the people making those decisions are the people that have always lived in a house, in a 3-bed semi-D, right? And there are other people that would be perfectly happy to live in a professionally serviced apartment.
I know.
You know,
like when we were buying this, like the small garden didn't bother us at all because we had a big garden in our other house, and twice a year we sat out there. You know, it was just another job to do. You know, to like keep it tidy and
and we need that mix.
Clean up after the dog. You know, so you know, I think you're right. I think it is that agricultural farming background that we've all come from in Ireland, but you know, we've got a lot of people that aren't Irish living here now as well.
Correct.
They're happy to live in apartments. They've come from apartments.
Exactly. They're used to apartment living and we're not.
Yeah, and we're not.
For sure, yeah.
So tell me about some of the positive initiatives. We discussed these before, the positive initiatives that have now been brought in the last 12 to 18 months by the government.
Like there's a kind of a dizzying array of new initiatives that have come in or have been altered, whether they be on the buy side or the develop side or the rental side. That are having a positive effect, and so like the Project Tusig, right? Project Tusig 1, Project Tusig 2, and that's where the state is buying units off developers, funding them to develop them directly, or in some cases doing joint ventures with them to do it together. Cost rental, I think, is a game changer. And cost rental is basically if you went and developed your own house and you added up the cost of the construction and the contractor and the fees and whatever else you had to do, and then you basically went for a mortgage for that. Your land was already there, let's say, because a lot of this is public. And basically then it's cost rent. So it's just the cost and you rentalise that over 40 years. And that's your kind of mortgage, right? So cost rent is, you know, 20, 30, 40% cheaper than market rent. And therefore, from an affordability point of view, it gives people a chance to rent affordably and save. So they have security of tenure, so they can stay for 20, 30, 40 years, or they can stay for 5 years, build up their deposit, and then when they move out, they've got their Help to Buy scheme, or they've got their shared equity, and you can do both.
And is this open, like this is open to people who are working in LinkedIn? You know, this is open to everybody? Or is it necessarily people who might be on...
The cost rent is below a certain salary band.
Okay.
Right, so net salary of 59,000 as a combined salary for a unit. And so there are limits. So it is trying to hit affordability. So the people that can afford it can buy the units or pay market rent, but for the people that are struggling affordable-wise, which is a huge percentage of people, because when you actually look at the stats of what people earn in Ireland, you know, and as part of the Housing Commission report, you would have seen in that report, you know, the very narrow percentages that we're dealing with that can actually afford people paying €2,500 a month for a 2-bed apartment. So the LDA is largely focused on cost rental, and we're seeing those schemes just now starting to come out, right? So it takes about 3 to 4 years to get a scheme from we've got the site to turning a key with no judicial review and no planning delays and no infrastructure delays and no funding delays and no insolvency delays. So all going sweet as a nut, we're 3 to 4 years. So we can't put something in place on year 1 and then start giving out in year 2 saying they haven't delivered, right? So these things take a long time. There's a long gestation period for them. And then because cost rental was very much for the public sector schemes and the councils and the LDA, they brought out STAR, which is for the private sector. And you have to keep the property in cost rental for 50 years. But then there's elements of subvention there per unit. Croí Connotha is another one. Croí Connotha was brought out to address build to sell. So a lot of the things out there are dealing with rental, but this is dealing for sale. So it's like if Tiffany has a development and it costs you 500,000 or 592,000 to develop a 2-bed apartment, but you can only sell that for 500 in the market net. Then you've got this gap. And what Croí Cónaithe does is it fills the gap and it gives you the 92,000. Now, that hasn't produced as many units as we'd like so far, and it's still in its infancy, but it's addressing a particular part. But the developer still takes the risk. So if he can't find enough Tiffany's in the marketplace, then the risk is still on the developer. So hence the reticence, I think, in the take-up. And that's still a risky road, because you have to deliver, build, finish, and then see whether or not there's a buyer there for your product.
And so the LDA, they are, I was telling you about this the last day, that when I was in Milan, I was stayed in an Airbnb in a beautiful big apartment building with marble floors and, you know, beautiful detailing in the lifts and the public areas and the lobbies. And I looked it up afterwards, and this apartment building was owned by the local government in Milan. It was specific to Milan, this model that they had. But something like 40% of the housing in Milan is owned by the state. And is the LDA going to get, I mean, if we were to scale the LDA, say, is that something that's possible?
I think it's a bit like the Fingal scheme or the Oscar Road. They're a joint scheme. And I think the idea is to avoid the mistakes of the past, where we've had just one tenure and it didn't work. A mixed tenure is the way forward. So we have private, we have social, we have cost rental, we have affordable purchase, all in the one.
In the same development.
Yeah. And I think that's what a lot of those countries, it's what Germany does. It's what we've done here to a tiny degree so far. And I think when you look back in 10 years' time and you look back on these few years post-COVID, we will see this chunk of housing that's been developed, which is largely public. The public have funded it, or they've bought it at the other end, or they've directly developed it. And when you hear politicians talking about the fact that we need to set up a national building company, right? If we look at the companies that are out there, the big companies, the construction companies and the developers who work extremely hard to deliver low single-digit profits, and all the issues that are involved in that, and like a lot of the insolvencies that we've seen across the UK, like, it is not for the faint-hearted, right? So there is no one answer. We have to do a lot of different things, and we have to open all those doors and develop housing in different lines and different typologies for different tenures at different life stages to try and come up with an overall number. It is not just one thing. There is no one answer for it. And I think that's where we need it. But like even a small thing like the levies. So you have to pay, 10 to 20,000 euros a unit to the government for statutory fees. Right, development contributions to pay for your local roads and so on. And the government last year brought out this thing where they would waive those for a period of 12 months. And it really stirred up the market in a positive way, right? People went, my scheme was struggling. I had, it changed the overall figure, but it might be 5 or 6% depending on the scheme. And next thing, suddenly a scheme was viable. Like that one thing made such a change, right? And I know we've talked about VAT a lot, and in the UK there's no VAT on starter homes. What would that do here? And I think my thought is that the government are very fearful about doing something that will stoke house inflation. And what they do not want to get is you're funding developers, and we go back to those days of old that people kind of hark on about. Again, let's look at the data. Right, and I think the government, in my mind, over the last number of years, have moved a lot towards doing detailed reports, figuring out what are the actual costs. Go away, do the research, spend 6 months or 12 months, do the research, and give us a set of numbers that we can rely on, as opposed to hearsay, because there's so much detail and every party is coming at it from a slightly different area. But they took that information in and they made a call, and it had a positive change. And there's a lot of those things, and they just need to, regardless of government, stay in place. to keep the momentum, because the change is what stops investors coming into the country, because they go, oh, we'll come in, we'll invest for this 30 or 40 years, the next thing you'll hit us with rent caps. And now you've just changed my whole investment, right? And if you did that in any other sector, people would go, oh, that's a junk bond kind of investment. What are we doing here?
It's uncertainty.
We need to control it.